This episode of The Biggest Table is brought to you in part by Wild Goose Coffee. Since 2008, Wild Goose has sought to build better communities through coffee. And for our listeners, Wild Goose is offering a special promotion of 20% off a one-time order using the code TABLE at checkout. To learn more and to order coffee, please visit wildgoosecoffee.com. In this episode of The Biggest Table, I converse with Michael Beck, a pastor, professor, and author about experiencing God's love through community, especially in unconventional settings like tattoo parlors, dog parks, and burrito shops. Michael shares his personal story of childhood trauma, addiction, and solitary confinement, and how he found community and redemption. We discuss the benefits of 12-step recovery programs in fostering deep, supportive relationships and explore how these principles can be applied to build inclusive, loving, and spiritually nourishing communities. The conversation touches on the themes from Michael's recent book, Never Alone, the epidemic of loneliness, and practical steps to create meaningful connections in today's digital and often isolating world. I hope you enjoy the episode. Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Biggest Table. I am your host, Andrew Camp, and in this podcast, we explore the table, food, eating, and hospitality as an arena for experiencing God's love and our love for one another. And today, I'm joined by Michael Beck. Michael is a pastor, professor, author, and one of the rare leaders bridging frontline ministry with academic scholarship. Alongside his wife, Jill, he has led multiple revitalizations and planted unconventional faith communities among those often overlooked. They currently serve as co-pastors of Compassion and St. Mark's United Methodist Churches, where they lead Open Arms Village, a holistic recovery housing program, and oversee a network of fresh expressions, worshiping communities that gather in places like tattoo parlors, dog parks, burrito shops, EV charging stations, digital spaces, and recovery centers. Michael also serves as Director of Fresh Expressions Florida, Director of the Fresh Expressions House of Studies at Perkins School of Theology at SMU, and Director of Fresh Expressions. His most recent book, Never Alone, explores how churches can address the epidemic of loneliness with the gospel's radical promise of community. So thanks for joining me today, Michael. Really enjoyed your book, Never Alone, and really think it fits with the themes I'm exploring here on The Biggest Table. So thanks for joining me today.
Thank you, Andrew. I love the theme of your podcast and the goodness you're trying to put into the world. So thanks for letting me be a part of it.
Yeah. So where I want to start is just because I think your backstory helps provide the framework for how you approach community. So can you give my listeners sort of a little background of who you are, where you've come from, and how that has motivated you to explore community in these fresh ways?
For sure. So I was born addicted. My biological mother was not really able to care for me at that time. My biological father was unknown. And so I was adopted by my grandparents for a time in my early childhood. And they kind of dragged me to this little church in Ocala, Florida, St. Mark's UMC, even when I didn't want to go sometimes. But my childhood, I remember, just a really warm, pleasant experience of the church and church people. And people really nurtured me, rallied around me in my infant baptism and committed to raise me in a community of love and forgiveness, and fed me through their never-ending potlucks, and just really nurtured me in the faith. My grandpa died when I was 10, and then my grandmother died, and I dropped out in the 9th grade. Drugs, alcohol, got involved in some selling drugs, gangs, ended up in juvenile detention a lot, and then ultimately jail, and encountered Jesus in a solitary confinement cell. So part of what I speak with Never Alone is, having been somebody who did over a month in a solitary confinement cell, which I feel human beings made in the image of God and created for community and love, to put them in a box by themselves for extensive periods of time can be a really cruel form of punishment that we still do every day, even to juveniles and kids, actually, in our justice system. But I had an encounter. For me, like Merton says, we move into the solitude, not to come away from the world or to be set apart from the world, but to make that discovery of the true self, unmask the distorted false self, and find our true self in God. So that kind of happened for me in a jail cell,
Huh.
where people were kind of breaking every day. Like people
Yeah.
committed suicide, they do all kind of crazy stuff. So long story short, I'll wrap it up with this, but I got out of jail, went back to that little church that nurtured me, that raised me.
Mm.
And luckily there was a recovering alcoholic pastor there, Pastor Dan Jones. And he said, I told him my whole story, how I think I met Jesus, and he spoke to me, and there was like light in my jail cell and all this stuff. And
Huh.
he said, well, I'm glad Jesus has saved your soul, but AA will save your butt. Used another word there that I
Yeah.
won't say on your holy sacred space here, but so he said, meet me at the noon meeting tomorrow. Let me show you how to do life sober. And that was 18 years ago. And really the deepest sense of community that I've known in my discipleship and my walk with Jesus has been the 12-step fellowship community, which is where I really still lean in today for that koinonia, that depth of community where we can
Mm.
just bring our full selves and stuff. And so a lot of my ministry flows out of all of that.
For sure. Wow. What a gift that in the midst of such pain and sorrow, Jesus met you in a solitary space.
Yeah.
Uh,
You
and
know,
then yeah, go ahead.
sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there.
No.
Um, I just need to say that I am back as the pastor of that church. So
Mm.
St. Mark's UMC, I'm now the place where I was baptized as a baby and nurtured and all of that. I'm back as the pastor. And in Methodism, we have this prolific hymn writer in our tradition named Charles Wesley, and
Right.
he wrote many, many hymns. But one of my favorites is "And Can It Be?"
Mm.
And one of my favorite lines in all of like Christian literature and music is, "Long my imprisoned spirit lay, fast bound in sin in nature's night. Thine eye diffused a quickening ray. I woke, the dungeon flamed with light. My
Mm.
chains fell off, my heart was free. I rose, went forth, and followed thee." So that hymn is basically my story. Charles Wesley was singing my story, and
Yeah.
it's not just some words for me. It's like literally my experience of Jesus. And my wife and I try to cultivate that same kind of thing with others through community.
You mentioned that, that really AA and other addiction recovery groups have been your strongest sense of community. And so, I've never participated in an AA or recovery group, and I'm guessing many of my listeners haven't. So, like, what is it about AA groups that can be so profound and maybe more biblically centered community than a evangelical church?
Yeah. So, Acts 2, I love that as a kind of a blueprint where they dedicated themselves to the apostles' teaching, the
Right.
breaking of the bread, and the prayers. They met daily in their homes around tables, right? So they
Yeah.
were breaking bread, having meals, and they were going to the temple frequently. So they had this inherited kind of church thing, temple stuff, but they were really doing life and community together around the table in their homes and constantly together. And I think what AA does and other fellowships like it is it creates that consistent kind of contact
Mm.
where we're really working out our spirituality, and it's a broad range of spirituality, right? Like people
Yeah.
bring different higher powers to the space,
Hmm.
but the 12 steps that Bill and Bob developed actually came out of the Oxford group and they're just basically Christianity 101.
Yeah.
Like Frank Buckman was the priest, and I love Richard Rohr talks about in Breathing Underwater that the 12-step spirituality is America's one unique, like, great contribution to the spiritual landscape. But the community part of it, that's the important thing that I think we don't do in churches real well. And I don't want to keep harping on Methodism, but I'm kind of a Methodist, so just
Yeah.
forgive me for that, listeners, who that's not your hive there. But um, in the early Methodism, you had societies, classes, bands. So field preaching, awakening to God's grace, small group. The only requirement for membership was the desire to flee the wrath to come. Wesley's language. That's 12-step, right? The only requirement is a desire to stop drinking. So, and then the honest confession that happens in that
Yeah.
space. James 5 says, confess your sins one to another, you'll be healed. Forgiveness comes directly through God, right? But um, for healing comes through confession and doing that in community with others. So in a 12-step fellowship, we literally sit there and say, basically, this is how I sucked this week. This is how I sinned or I messed up or whatever.
Hmm.
And we can just kind of be honest about that and support each other in real spiritual growth. Where sometimes I feel like in a church, you come, you do this service and you sing some songs and you maybe do a Bible study together and you have some koinonia there. But are we doing the deep penetrating, like really, how goes it with your soul, and trying to spiritually grow out of those old, like in the language of Celebrate Recovery, hurts, habits, and hangups?
Yeah.
Whereas 12-step communities really open a space for you to do that.
Gotcha. So, yeah, because there is a lot of intentionality with the 12 steps, and there is, I like the idea of steps because there is the process. My wife's a clinical psychologist, and she's done a little some recovery stuff, and so like I have a vague awareness of it, but nothing. But many people have talked about how AA might be closer to biblical community than a lot, and some of it's the intentionality, but like you said, it's that confessing of sins and saying, hey, I messed up. But it's also that realization you're in the midst of people who recognize their lowness, and that maybe that can help too. Whereas in Christian community or small groups, we can pretend a lot.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
And then we're hearing a lot of talk too then about this loneliness, this epidemic of loneliness we're experiencing, and the detrimental effects of social media and technology on belonging. You talk about Jonathan Haidt's book, The Anxious Generation, which is a great book to sort through and think through. We have a 6 and an 8-year-old to think through how we want them to approach technology. But how is then this epidemic impacting Christian community, and what are ways that you're looking to then use your recovery programs as means to address this epidemic of loneliness?
Yeah, I think I started to realize early on in my ministry that the thing that really people were mostly struggling with, and the really unhealthy kind of behavior patterns, was like loneliness. People were just lonely, and I will sadly say that I don't think the church was really kind of providing the kind of community that they needed to heal that loneliness. So a lot of people just kind of checked out on church or tried to find that other places. I live in this weird world where it's like I'm a pastor, but I'm also a professor. So I'm a graduate instructor of sociology at the University of Florida,
Oh, wow.
and I did this last semester. We had like the TikTok, went away for 2 or 3 days. I'm
Yeah.
not personally really invested in TikTok, but my students are very invested in it, right? And I was watching like that. We do this on Tuesdays. We do kind of a conversational, they'll practice a philosophy and we share about it. And I also do church in a rehab on Monday nights called Higher Power Hour with people that have substance abuse, chemical dependency kind of stuff. We do church there. And I was watching these young people like literally detoxing, like having all the same symptoms, right?
Wow.
So there's something, I'm all for online church. Let me say this so I don't get, crucified by the online church people. We do some online stuff. We did a church, VR church for a long time. And so I believe you can form community in digital space. But we have to hold that with the data, beside the data that shows that for a lot of people, they use technology not in a way to kind of create community, but to create maybe kind of a counterfeit community.
Right.
And in Never Alone, I try to talk about the long history of that, right? Because go all the way back to like Genesis 1, 2, and 3. And then you have Cain and Abel, and then you have Cain fleeing over to Nod, a city where they build these instruments, and the first musical instruments and the first like city technology takes place, bronze tools.
Yep.
And they basically create a counterfeit community to like live life apart from God. Right? So technology can build an ark, Noah, where we can like cradle life and sustain life, and we get instructions from God to like use this technology to do good in the world. And then you have this other extreme where it's like we can also use technology to create this counterfeit community. And I think a lot of what people, their online life more gravitates to that counterfeit thing. We're the attention economy, right? We're just being algorithmed into paying attention to these things, and we're kind of neglecting our own real depth of relationships and our own spiritual needs and such. And so I think the thing that I'm trying to communicate in the book is the gospel is not just a message about Jesus. That's part of it, right? But it is actually a community that we're offering.
Right.
Like we're baptized into a community. And the good news is that when you come into relationship with Jesus, when you accept and embrace that, you come into a community that is his body.
Yep.
So our proclamation's been kind of shallow and collapsed, like, hey, accept these propositions about Jesus, and go to heaven when you die. And that's really not his message at all. It was like,
No.
come follow me. Like, are you weary and burdened? Come and yoke with me. You'll find rest for your soul. And his good news involves this kind of community life.
Yeah. No, because you mentioned a few times that throughout the book that our salvation, our redemption is communal.
Yes.
Which, American ideology and our values, many of them, just to put it bluntly, are anti-gospel, whether it's the pursuit of happiness or individualism or, fear of missing out. All of these ideologies that are shaping who we are not leading us into this communal life that, God originally created us to live into. And so then, you mentioned then that as we're making evangelistic strategies, we're actually asking the wrong questions that people are no longer wanting answers to. And so what have you found? Like, can you explain that to people? Because, I feel it. I felt it, working in evangelical churches and, what we wanted, how we talked about evangelism. But like, help us unpack that, so that we can ask the right questions that people want answers to.
For sure. I gotta just share like an illustration of this. That's at the University of Florida. We have this big place called Plaza of the Americas, and all day long, hundreds of students are gathering out there throughout the day, gathering on blankets, doing yoga or having diary time where they're journaling together, or some of them are having Bible studies, doing improv, playing instruments, just pretty much all the things you can do.
Yeah.
There's a gentleman who shows up pretty almost every day and has a bullhorn, some signs, the standard kind of repent, believe sequence kind of thing.
Yep.
And he stands out there and proclaims his version of the gospel. And it's actually not cringy, some of the how he's presenting it. It's about love. It's about God's love and God's reaching out in love. And I've stopped and just listened, and I've never really seen a student stop and engage him in a conversation. And maybe they are, and I'm just not seeing it. But if he would just put that bullhorn down and go sit on the blanket with some of those students, he would hear them talking about spirituality and talking about the joys and the struggles of life. And if he would just ask some questions, he would find that they are actually developing church and community right there in those blankets.
Yeah.
So I think one way we present, I consider myself an evangelical. I'm almost scared to use that word in this climate, but
right.
I want people to know the gospel of Jesus. I want them to experience communal life in Jesus the way that I have. That's turned my world, right side up and changed my life. I want people to know that. And I think we need to do that in a trauma-informed way, knowing that most of what people see as evangelical has actually been very harmful in their life. Some of the research shows 1 in 3 Americans have experienced religious trauma. And we've been able, in like a Constantinian Christendom mode of church, to do the, monologue presentation. Here's what you need to know. Now respond to it intellectually. Whereas Jesus was really a dialogical preacher, right? He asked, 307 questions, and he invited people into stories, and he would share the story. And he basically planted his church around a table. And this is why I love your podcast. Because he was just going around throwing dinner parties, right? He was inviting people to have meals together, and they were like sharing life, and the guest list was sketchy. anybody was invited, and the religious leaders criticized them because of that. They're like, this guy eats with unclean hands. He has bad table manners. He's not doing the ritual cleansings, and look at the people who are at his table, sinners, tax collectors.
Yeah.
But that's basically how he started the church, is around food and tables and community. And in that relational kind of space, people's lives were transfigured. So what we do with like a fresh expression is we do a lot of dinner churches, which is specifically just church around the table. But we do it more dialogical than monological.
Yep.
We'll do a quick little clip from like a Jesus story, and then we'll share that, 3 to 5 minutes, and then we'll ask some questions. Or we'll start with, like in Tattoo Parlor Church, we go around, everybody shares the story behind their tattoo.
Right.
And so you got Christians, non-Christians, everything in between, all gathered in this tattoo parlor. And where some of us are clearly, Jesus people, and we bring that into the conversation. Other people are bringing other stuff. But when you create that space for that conversation and just share Jesus in the midst of that, and know that his risen self is at work in that space, like he's moving in people's lives and in that conversation. So that's kind of what we do. So it starts more with community and creating belonging.
Mm-hmm.
And then believing comes at the pace of grace for every person, and maybe never at all.
Yeah.
And so some people that participate in our fresh expressions, I could name several right now. They self-proclaimed atheists, right? But they show up every week. They're part of the community. They help make coffee. They do stuff. They set up. So creating that space for belonging where people can know that koinonia, and then we just watch the Holy Spirit work on people as they whatever pace, the Lord is working in their life and calling them to himself.
Wow, there's a lot to unpack there. It's beautiful. It's great because it is like, because one other thing that stuck out to me, and I've heard other people mention it, like David Fitch has mentioned it, of like this idea that we go into the world as guests, not as hosts. And I think what you were mentioning, a lot of our preaching, or we want to teach people into the kingdom, and so we're hosting, we're in charge, but the posture of a guest, changes it, where, like you said, you can listen to the stories, you can see the Holy Spirit being the true host and hosting and making people and guiding people into their discussion. And so I think that's just such an important posture for us to take, where it's we go into the spaces people are as guests, not with the answers, but maybe willing just to listen.
Right. Yeah. The end of the home field advantage, right? Like,
yeah.
What I try to teach our team, a lot of how we go about this is centered in Luke 10, 1-9. So for our listeners, that's where Jesus sends them out 2 by 2, the disciples, the apostles. They tells them, travel light, leave your stuff behind, go. It's going to be dangerous. There's sheep among wolves out there. Find the person of peace. And that person's peace will rest on you. Your peace will rest on them. There'll be a peace exchange. Do life at their table. Eat whatever's set before you. Right? And then heal, bless, proclaim the kingdom. That's his, it's his church planning strategy. It's his changing the world strategy.
Right.
So it's not about hospitality. I like to teach our team, it's about guestitality. And you are the recipient of grace. You're the recipient of peace. You're the recipient of the hospitality of the people that you're sent to. So our whole thing is like, who are the persons of peace? Like the director of the rehab that lets us come in on Monday night in her facility and do church, or the tattoo parlor shop owner who lets us come in and do that, or our burritos, Tijuana Flats, where we have our burritos and Bibles, the manager who lets us come in the store and have Jesus conversations and eat burritos. Those persons of peace, they're hosting us, and then our job is to be good guests.
Yeah.
And for so long, the church has just been able to play host and, come to us, our building. We're doing hospitality team teachings, right? You go through the hospitality training and you get to be on the hospital. And we should still do those things. And the Fresh Expressions way is not saying, let's not do inherited traditional church.
Right.
And we're saying we need both and. We need temple and table. We need both. But a lot of Christians just don't know how to do the table thing or that second piece. We've just been able to invite people and say, come to our stuff. And all the greatest blunders of mission history have been with that idea, right? Like
Yep.
we have the stuff, we have the resources, we're going to go. And then you get like the replacement model of mission, which is conquistadors literally coming in and like wiping people out, or the ennoblement model of mission where European Enlightenment culture, we're going to go ennoble all the other, inferior people out there. Those are really just harmful, bad things where Jesus' whole way was you go empty yourself, right?
Right.
Kenosis, listen, build relationships, and through that, at table and healing each other, the kingdom manifests through that.
Wow. Again, there's so much goodness about the community you're talking about, because it is, um, if we're going to think through what it means to belong in this culture, like we're going to have to change the way we do it, and we're going to have to listen, because like you said, Jesus built community around tables with misfits, and he invited all to the table. And so I was reflecting on your book, and I was like, okay, like it seems like Jesus's story and invitation is an exercise in how to sit at tables with people who we vehemently disagree with and yet are still willing to love. Because I think that's the invitation, because too many, it's so easy to get siloed, and not, which isn't the true expression of community. And so like, how do we sit at tables with people we will vehemently disagree with? And like, I'm guessing recovery programs have helped you do that, because I'm guessing you've heard some crazy ideas
Mm-hmm.
through recovery, but you still show up and you still love. And so how can recovery, this idea in even recovery groups, model how to sit with people who we may vehemently disagree with?
Yeah, I love this. And if this is too political or off base, just rein me back in here. But I'm just sitting here thinking about, the Pope's death.
Yeah.
And this morning we found out about that. And one of the last things that he did was sit down with J.D. Vance, right?
Right.
And the Pope was very public about not really agreeing with a
No.
lot of the current administration policies, but sat and they had a conversation. And I don't really know the details of that, but I imagine they have some differences, at least minor, about things. And yet he made space for that. And yeah, in the recovery community, we know everybody's different. And the goal of recovery is not to convert people, right?
Mm-hmm.
We're a program of attraction rather than promotion, and we're just trying to live a life of recovery and be of service to others. And then by doing that, it strengthens our own recovery. So this is just, I know a lot of people struggle with this, but for me, it's just has been a natural part of my spiritual development. Like when we go to Higher Power Hour, this is a state facility. So some people are quartered to be there. Some people have gone through the self admission into detox kind of. So one of our persons of peace, Megan, who's the director of the center, says, you can't call it church, and you can't, there's certain boundaries you have to. So in the beginning, we say, hey, we know everybody here is coming from different spiritual spaces, and maybe you have different ideas about your higher power. But what we're here to do is we know every relapse 100% of the time comes down to a failure to enlarge our spiritual life. So that's the purpose of Higher Power Hour. We're going to all learn from each other as a community of equals, and everybody gets to speak as an equal into the space. And some of us are coming from a Jesus space,
Right.
and some are not. So in that dynamic, people feel free to come out and share kind of where their spirituality is. And my job in that is not to like convert, okay, let's do the Romans Road now and sinner's prayer. Sometimes people do respond in that way, and I'm always grateful to pray with somebody in that moment. It's beautiful. But that's not necessarily what we're trying. It's not like a conversion tactic kind of thing. We really do believe that Jesus is risen, right? And he really is in that room.
Yeah.
I believe he's involved in every person's life in that room, whether they call his name or not. I know that he's there before we get there. And I'm just trying to trust him and trying to do my best imperfectly
Yep.
and failing at it to live and be the aroma of Christ in a way that people are like, maybe that Christian thing, is not as bad as I originally thought. Or
Right.
so, yeah, that's the thing.
Mhm.
In community with others, right? Then
Yeah.
we experience God's love.
No, we do. And it starts, for you, you have these sort of three values that I think underline, everything you want to do. It's original goodness, original trauma, and original unity. And with original goodness, you want us to start not with that we are all sinners in need of God's grace, but that we were created already good and infinitely worthy of divine love. And so how is that that's a different starting point than maybe many of us were taught as evangelicals, like we're a sinner in need of redemption. So how does starting with goodness help you, and how can it help us create more life enriching community?
Yeah, and this is what kind of got me put into the heretic camp here, so I guess I'll go ahead and accept it. But so the Bible doesn't start with you suck and you're terrible and there's nothing you can do about it.
No.
It starts with you are good.
Yep.
That God creates the world good and God creates everything in the world good. Tov is the Hebrew word, and God creates us. And we get the first very good when he gets to humans, right?
Yep.
Very tov, very good.
Yep.
And that's our imago Dei, the goodness. We're created in the image of a good God, made of good material that God made and spoke and took mud and shaped us and formed us and breathed into us, ruach, and we become nephesh, living beings in his image. That's the starting point of the Bible. And so I think our evangelism should start with that with people.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like telling them how terrible they are and bullhorning them, but really affirming the good that they already are, that God has already stamped God's divine image on them. The next movement of that is the original trauma, though. So I would say we're not all good, right?
No.
We have this original goodness that's baked into us. And by the way, this is just Wesleyan theology 101. It's not really new. It's been lost for a long time, I think. But
Yeah.
that's where you get like the total depravity kind of thing. And I can, I can accept that there's a piece of us that's broken, right? That comes from this original trauma, this wound
Yeah.
that we all have. We need healing from that. And wounded people act out of their woundedness, right? And they do bad
Mm-hmm.
things and all of that. We're all in that space where all of us in some way have been wounded. We carry that in being sin that has to be healed by Jesus. And then there's that final movement. So Wesleyans talk about prevenient grace, justifying grace, sanctifying grace. And that's where I like the way Thomas Merton frames this, though, that's the oneness that we already are.
Yeah.
That we're not one is actually the distortion. That's the illusion that we
Yep.
ego, self, and distorted false mask and separation. But actually, when we discover Christ discovering us, we actually see we're actually unified with all human beings, all of
Mm-hmm.
time, everywhere, and that we really are a oneness. So I think what the world hears, and just let me be a little bit like facetious with it, but they hear us saying, "You suck. There's nothing you can really do about it. But there's a really good God who loves you, and he loves you so much, he punished the hell out of his own son on a
Yeah.
cross. And through this act of divine child abuse, you, if you accept it, can receive eternal life. And you go to this beautiful heaven city place rather than an eternity in hell, if you just believe this stuff and accept it. And I don't think that divine child abuse is happening on the cross. I think we're seeing a crucified God on the cross. We're
Right.
seeing God himself take all the pain and sin of the world into his own body and breaking its power and giving us resurrection life. So there is good news in that. It's the way we framed it and presented it. Is I start with the goodness that people are. And
Yeah.
most of us, especially recovery people who we know we know we got issues, right?
Right.
We don't need anyone to help us convince us of that.
No.
Usually we need a healer, and we need to find the goodness in ourselves.
Mm.
Usually forgiving ourselves and self-compassion is usually a big struggle for a lot of humans.
Yeah.
And so we can create space where we can affirm the goodness of people, right? It's the
Yep.
kindness of God that leads us to repentance. We
Yep.
love because he first loved us. So what if we create communities where people can find their own goodness and
Mhm.
respond in that way rather than, oh, punishment, going to go to hell. Like the good news for me is Jesus came into my living hell. I
Yeah.
was already in hell. I was already separated from God and myself in the world, and he pulled me out of that. And I think that's the experience of a lot of people. So the good news of that is that Jesus offers us that now, right?
Right. No, for sure. Because you quote Thomas Merton of like, Christian love isn't about the will to love, but it's about accepting the love that already is there. I think I'm
Yeah.
paraphrasing it, but it is. It's not willing myself to love, but it's recognizing the love that is inherent in God through His creation, through other people, through His church. Um, so if I can experience that love in some way,
Mm.
and it can rid myself of this performance-based Christianity, uh,
Yeah,
and yeah, go ahead.
absolutely. And I feel like actually science validates the original goodness of human beings. So I do a lot in the book with like the concept of compassion,
Right.
a sensitivity to suffering and self and others with a desire to alleviate and prevent it. And if we look back, early hominids, right, we see massive injuries and wounds and debilitating diseases. And even early hominids had the capacity to care for each other and to be compassionate. So you see healing in the bone record of people that would have been debilitated. And
Hmm.
human beings, Charles Darwin said, sympathy is our greatest instinct.
Hmm.
Not he wasn't the survival of the fittest guy. That was Herbert Spencer who came along later, right? But
Right.
he actually did a lot with emotion and that human
Hmm.
emotion and the ability to feel empathy and care for one another and love each other is the defining thing about human beings. And all species have this to some level, but humans are in a way like wired, our brains, our physiology, everything, fight, flight response, the vagus nerve, that's where compassion happens. So we're
Right.
literally designed to care about each other and to love. That's good, right? So
Yeah.
if science is saying we're good and the Bible's saying we're good, and why do we measure ourselves by our worst mistakes in life or by our bad stuff? The cumulative goodness of most people I know, right? Like most of us every day, we're trying to do kind things for people that nobody sees.
Yep.
We're trying to help people. I think most human beings are like that. But then, and obviously there are always exceptions to the rule and there's evil and there's demonic, like I believe in all that
Yeah.
stuff. But for the most part, most people I know are actually good because we're created in the image of a good God and we're trying to live that out. And we want to take those big mistakes or those big failures and define ourselves by that. And the world does that, right?
Yep.
Cancel culture and all this stuff. We don't need to be doing that as the church, right? We
No.
we need to help people find that worth and that affirming that goodness and see how God can help that flourish in us.
No, it is. And community feels like such a needed gift that we can offer the world, and yet such an impossible task.
Mm,
Right now, given the climate, and that we don't want to sit with people, like we demonize the other side, and so where I can affirm my goodness, I can be quick to disaffirm the goodness in other people, like, oh, you said that, you must be a horrible person. Like if you voted for the wrong party, you're not part of this.
right.
Um, and so, you know, again, if this gift of Jesus is learning to sit with people who disagree, we disagree with, like what role does boundaries play? Like how do we cultivate a safe community, um, given, you know, trauma too, like,
Yeah.
because we bring our trauma into it and we're going to hurt other people. And so we want to provide a safe holding space to deal with trauma, but also welcome people and have good boundaries. So like, how do you hold boundaries and keep boundaries so that your community can stay safe?
Yeah, I love that question. And I don't want to keep drawing upon, 12-step fellowships, but it's kind of, the world that I live in. I know it's
Yeah.
not the answer to everything, but we just have some really good ground rules, some principles that hold the community together, a clear mission, a clear process, the 12 steps. And then we have the 12 traditions with things like it's not about, people before personalities, just a simple how we're going to function. There's no leader. Every group is autonomous. Those clear kind of guidelines are really helpful to mitigate that kind of damage and harm that can happen. Wesleyan, so we have this thing that we say that comes from Wesley, like do all the good you can, all the places you can, all the ways you can, and do no harm. So the key thing with anything that we start is we don't want to further harm people. So that's training with my leaders. It's having a small group of people that my wife and I are really discipling. So we gather them together once a month in our home. I work with the guys, Jill works with the ladies, and we do literally like band meeting, sanctification kind of stuff.
Wow.
Small group, just, how did we sin and how are we progressing with our spiritual life? And I make sure those people are good and healthy. And I'm trying to support them and nourish them as they lead the things that we're doing. And there's times in meetings where gatherings where people say things that you have to correct in the moment and say things like, that actually could be really harmful for some people in the circle, what you just said there. We try to honor every contribution, and sometimes when something's way out left field, every person gets to share as an equal, right? But then we'll say things like, here's one way that think about that. Here's another way that maybe Christians have thought about this for about 2,000 years, or here's a specifically Wesleyan way to think about what you just shared. So we're honoring, we're bringing it in, but when things are harmful, we have to name that. And then there are times we've had to tell people this group's probably not for you, or we've had to meet with people after and say, hey, you have to either stop, this kind of behavior or saying these kind of things, or you're not going to be welcome to come here anymore. It's sad when that has to happen, but it's something that has to happen as a leader to do that, to protect the other people that are involved.
That makes a lot of sense, and I appreciate that wisdom. And again, it seems the 12 recovery programs have a lot to offer as we think through, okay, how do we form community? Like, we don't need to reinvent the wheel always. Like, there's good resources that might be just outside the church, but within the church walls, that we can, use some of their ideas, and think through what it means to do this community. And so for us who are longing for community and wanting something new or different, or just asking different questions, like besides starting a dinner church, or how do you help people just start? Like, where is the starting point? What's a small step that people can begin to take that might help them form and lean into better community?
For sure. I think to frame it, in the church, we do a lot of extrinsic motivation. So this is like something external to yourself, kind of telling you should do this, you should do that, because the Bible says it, or the church, or whatever. What we're doing with like the Fresh Expressions approach is intrinsic motivation. So it's asking questions of my people like, what is the Holy Spirit stirring in your heart? What's your wicked problem? What's that thing that keeps you up at night that you notice all the time that's not going to probably be resolved in our lifetime, but you just have a, passion for that thing? Like for me, that's recovery. It's overdose. It's all the things that, I've been part of my experience. But what's that for you, right? For each person. And then it's as simple as we say, don't do, like, our life is already full, right? Crazy amounts of stuff. We just multiple jobs, all that. So don't add more stuff to your life. But can you find a friend, do something you would already do in a place you would already do it? And can you think of that, how that might become its own little spiritual community, its own little pocket of communal life in Jesus? So, like, some people, they're not going to start Tattoo Parlor Church, right? They're not, no tattoos.
Nope, no tattoos for me. Tattoo Parlor Church is not, probably my best place to start.
Exactly. So that's probably not you. But like, what do we do? Burritos, I would sit at Tijuana Flats, who has a hot bar and just great burritos. And I would eat that with a couple people. if even it was just us showing up, right?
Right.
Dog park church. One of my 7-year-old what lay people started a church in a dog park called Paws of Praise. Larry. Yeah, and he just gets people who love their dogs, and they unleash their dogs, and they run around and play, and they circle up, and they do a little sermon and a prayer. So
Hmm.
what is that for you? Because a lot of people, they're finding some kind of community, right? And sadly, many people aren't, right?
Right.
That's the other part of it. But doing things you like to do together, practices that come together. Can you find a friend or more, or couple, do something you like to do together, share your faith as part of a larger picture of life together, and make it not weird and not sketchy, and just do what organically is happening in the room. So
Hmm.
that's kind of, I think any human can do this. And the other part of this is like Jesus equipped and gifted every priest in the priesthood of all believers to do this. We've made this so overly complicated, and there's like church planner people, and then there's professional priests and pastors, and none of it is faithful to the design of Jesus' church, right? He took everyday,
Right.
ordinary people, empowered them with the charisma, the simple treasury of Jesus stories.
Yeah.
Go out and share those, do life together around the table. It's any human can do that. You don't have to have a master's degree in divinity or any of that. So I think that's the starting point. Just get a couple people around some hobby, passion, interest, something you like to do. Identify some third place you like to do that in, or maybe it's your home or your work.
Right.
Get together, do that, and then find out what spiritual elements you could introduce as you go along, or what the community is comfortable.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And then taking that posture of being a guest, not coming with a plan, within few weeks, the X, Y, and Z are going to happen. But I think just this open-handed posture as you're inviting us into of, okay, Spirit, where are you working? What am I supposed to cooperate with you in?
Yeah.
And then what's not mine to bring to this, community?
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
uh, no, I love that, and I love finding those places you're already venturing into, because like you said, we don't need to add more. We
Right.
probably need to subtract a little bit, but where are those places we're already hanging out? And where can you find maybe a little more community or be a little more intentional? Uh,
Absolutely.
you know, and just listening to stories. I think sometimes listening to another person's story can be a profound act of love.
Yeah, I think the coolest thing that we teach in the Fresh Expression movement is this thing called the listening first journey, or the loving first journey, some
Yeah.
call it. But it's just the basic spiritual practices of Jesus, right? So you listen to God, to the community. You love the people around you and serve them. Some people want to kill the word serve because it comes off as whatever, but it's really just loving and building community. As you build community, learning each other's names, stories, getting to know each other, spending time together. Time is the fertilizer of good relationships. So just consistency of getting
Mm-hmm.
together. Then you explore spirituality, share Jesus, discipleship, whatever you want to call that component. Some people get freaked out about that. So that can be many things, right? It can
Right.
be some communities are ready for a Jesus story, and they're like, hey, we know you're a Christian, so tell us some stuff that Jesus said and let's talk about it. But sometimes it's like a poem that
Mm-hmm.
we just read the
Mm.
poem and we talk about it together. Or I'll literally sometimes take out my phone, and have like a playlist for every state, for like homegrown musical artists in each state.
Okay.
And I'll play a song, and we'll talk about what's the spirituality of this song.
Hmm.
Does anybody hear anything spiritual out of that? So people think, oh, it's now we got to do some sermon or something. Not always. It can be all kind of different dimensions that happen there. Like our tattoo talk is kind of the sermon when we do that in tattoo poetry.
Right.
But then after you do that for a while, church, you really start to have koinonia, and then you are baptizing people, or you're having the Lord's Supper for whoever's interested in that, or where like those more formal kind of church
Yeah.
elements start to become part of that community. But
Hmm.
yeah, sorry, that was a really long answer to the question.
No, it's a great. It's I wanted you to touch on that loving first journey, because I think it does provide a framework for us to think through how to do this. And it does get tricky as we build relationships of how do we bring in the spiritual. But I think if we believe that the Spirit is working and that Jesus is alive and working in this world, in every person who he created in his image, then they're doing something that brings them alive, and so how can you start having spiritual conversations that maybe not introduce Jesus right away, but at least get them thinking about what's stirring inside them.
Yeah,
And how is their body responding,
exactly.
I live in Flagstaff, Arizona, which is a big outdoor place. We live near Sedona. And so we love to hike, and so like hiking makes me feel alive. And so it's like, how do you help people see, okay, how does hiking help me connect with God or connect with the spiritual world in different ways? And so, yeah, I think there's ways to do it. It just, we get frightened and we don't want to be weird. And we don't want to break the relationship.
Right.
And so, but to take those steps is a challenge, and to own that.
Yeah. Do you do like a hiking church, hiking fresh expression, or
Not yet. Not
okay?
yet.
Because I would be down for that. I'd show up for that.
Yeah. No, and there's like literally live in like the largest ponderosa pine forest in the world. And we have the Grand Canyon an hour and a half away. And so there's ways to do it. And so how to do it well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's exactly the kind of thing that, that other people can connect around. And
yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or I just connected with, he's another podcaster down in Phoenix, but his brand is called Communion Wine Co. But he'll do wine tasting events at local wine bars and then have spiritual conversations with the wine tastings. And it allows, people, and he has ways for people to ask questions anonymously, but can have different discussions centered around wine and spiritual conversations and stuff. And so we're trying to figure out a way to do one in Flagstaff just to, connect the two of us, but then also like, okay, like this is a fun way to connect with people.
Yeah.
In different ways.
Yeah. And every time you do that, right, you create a little pocket of community that can heal people's lives and make one little, dent in the epidemic of loneliness and isolation that is killing people every day.
Yep. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, Michael, I've loved this conversation, and it's a question I ask all of my guests as we begin to wrap up, just because it's a good summary question. What's the story you want the church to tell?
I think the story that I want the church to tell is that there is resurrection and death. And I think we need to come to terms with the fact that church as we have known it is dying. And that's not a sad story. It's a joyful and hopeful story. Because there were wonderful things about the church that no community of people across history have done more, like to shape the world into a more loving, just, equitable, world than followers of Jesus. But there's also some things that were really limiting and cause a lot of harm, and the power structures and the hierarchy and those things have really damaged. They're kind of a blemish on the face of the bride of Christ. So we have an opportunity right now to kind of sit in that and watch Jesus bring something new out of the ashes. And so the story I hope that we can tell, I just get kind of bummed out. All the stories everywhere I go, denominational spaces mostly, but it's like, we're dying, decline, membership. We're, after COVID now, it's even worse, blah, blah, blah.
Yep.
And it's true. I mean, we can't sugarcoat that. The data is there. It shows that. But it's also, I think God's doing something in the midst of it.
Yeah.
And things like gathering people at tables and sharing Jesus and ways that connect with people where they do life. I think that's really exciting stuff that the Holy Spirit's up to in the world.
No, for sure. I love that. Um, yeah, because it is a challenging time, but like you said, if we truly believe in the Easter message, which we're recording the day after Easter, like
Right.
then we have to believe that out of death comes resurrection. That God can always make things new. And it may look different, and we may have to give up what we once held dear, but all shall be well.
Yes. Amen.
And then some fun questions about food to wrap up too. Just because
Okay.
since I love food, some fun questions. It's always fun to hear people's different response. So, what's one food you refuse to eat?
Brussels sprouts.
Okay. Why Brussels
My wife
sprouts?
makes them anyway, but
They're good for you.
they are good for you. I don't know if I was traumatized as a kid. I don't know where this comes from, Andrew, but I'm like, just the thought of them.
Okay.
Maybe my grandma tried to make me eat them when I was little. I don't know.
Fair enough. Yeah, there's a lot of trauma surrounding Brussels sprouts, probably because grandmas boiled them to death and they turned mushy and disgusting.
Yeah. And then try
But
to make us eat them.
yeah, okay, fair enough. Yes,
Yeah.
deep fried Brussels sprouts are delicious, but anything deep fried is usually delicious. So
Doesn't that take the health element away, or?
probably, but you know,
Okay.
eh. Then on the other end of the spectrum, what's one of the best things you've ever eaten?
Oh man, that's so hard. I'm a foodie. I guess since I've done church in a burrito place for like 12 years, I have to say that I will, if I died in a taco with a taco or burrito in my hand, I'd be a happy man.
Awesome. Well, that perfectly segues to my last question because there's a conversation among chefs about last meals, as in if you knew you only had one last meal to enjoy, what would be on your table? And so if
Oh,
Michael had one last meal, what would be included in his table?
dang it, this is going to kind of contradict what I just said, but if I could have a perfectly made piece of lasagna
Mm,
where the ricotta, fluffs up like a little blanket and
yeah.
it's layered and solid, I think if I had to, if that was my last request for a meal, I would go with that.
That does sound delicious. Do you have a favorite lasagna recipe or place to get like where it comes close, or is this an elusive dream you're always chasing?
It's definitely my wife's lasagna. She doesn't make it much, so it's like a rare sacramental thing because I
Yeah.
know it takes a lot of work and stuff. But
Yep.
yeah, she's definitely makes the best lasagna I've ever had.
That's awesome.
So shout out to Jill Beck.
There you go. Perfect. Michael, I've really enjoyed this conversation. And if people want to connect or learn more about Fresh Expressions or your work, where could they find you?
For sure. So I have a website, michaeladambeck.com is probably the easiest way to connect. I also do Substack. So our Substack's called Passional Church, Michael Adam Beck, and I do kind of just a weekly little reflection and do a lot of stuff there in the Substack. So
Awesome.
and then all the normal stuff, Facebook. I'm trying to make my way into Blue Sky, and so y'all come join Andrew and I in Blue Sky. We're trying to make
it happen.
move my way out of Twitter, but yeah.
Yep. I hear you. And also make sure to buy Never Alone, which is a great book. It really outlines, what we've talked about, but gives you some great stories, great ideas, and a framework to think through community. And so, yeah, Never Alone. It's now available through Herald Press. Thank you for your ministry to the church, to what you're doing, the hope you're bringing. You're a gift, Michael. So thank you.
So are you, brother. I appreciate it. Thanks for listening, everyone.
If you've enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing, leaving a review, or sharing it with others. Thanks for joining us on this episode of The Biggest Table, where we explore what it means to be transformed by God's love around the table and through food. Until next time, bye.